You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, how did the Sonics boom and then bust? But first, I want to tell you about a fellow HP Network podcast. You know that Nylon Calculus is the place to go for smart but accessible analysis of all things in the NBA. And now there's a new podcast called Nothing But Nylon. Hosted by Kevin Farragon, it is a place where NBA writers and researchers discuss their ideas and talk hoops and analytics. Check it out at nyloncalculus.com and on the Harbor Paroxysm Podcast Network. With me today is a special guest from ESPN and also a former employee of the Sonics, Kevin Pelton. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So excited to talk to you today about some Seattle Sonics history, the championship teams, the championship team of the late 70s, the back-to-back finals teams in 78 and 79 against the Bullets, with them winning the second of those matchups. A very young and very talented team with Gus Williams, Dennis Johnson, and Jack Sikma, all extremely complimentary and young, and sort of an ultimate what-if team of the time. With kind of a lot of what-if teams with the late 70s Blazers, all those teams that could potentially have competed with the Lakers as well, plus some talented teams, that Houston, San Antonio, the Suns, all interesting teams that are, of course, once the 80s come along, the Lakers are dominant in the West and no one else really has a chance. But so talking about the Sonics, really interesting how they sort of came out of nowhere in 78 with Williams coming over from the Warriors, Dennis Johnson having been a bench player, and Jack Sikma a rookie, and then sort of took the league by storm after a rough start to that season.
Well, more than nowhere in some ways when you think about the fact that they started that season 5-17 before Lenny Wilkens returned to the sidelines as head coach. He had been the director of player personnel originally after Russell was left, and his assistant Bob Hopkins had taken over as the head coach. So he takes over with the team, basically in last place, and then ends up taking them to the finals that year and to the championship the next year. It's hard to think of many kind of similar situations like that with an overnight turnaround in NBA history.
Yeah, absolutely. Curtis Harris once, we were talking and said that this Sonics team could easily have been the subject of the breaks of the game, because there's a lot of similarities in terms of how this team kind of came to rise out of nowhere. And then sort of a similar downfall with the dissension between Dennis Johnson and Coach Lenny Wilkens, which we'll get into. But this was sort of the aftermath of the Bill Russell era. He had been coach and general manager of the team for 4 seasons and sort of came in as an expected savior for the team, of course, being the greatest winner of all time, and hoping that he would bring some magic to the team. And while they certainly did improve, it was definitely considered a disappointment, and he was paid very highly by Sam Schulman, the owner, who was sort of a little bit of a maverick owner at the time. You could say he did things sort of challenge the system. He ended up breaking the NBA's policy of not signing underclassmen after he took Spencer Haywood, who had gone out early and played a season in the ABA, then ended up bringing him into the NBA, and was a guy who was not afraid to be sort of at the forefront. Maybe a little bit of a Mark Cuban of his time, you could say.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thought that popped in my head when you first started going down this line of thinking. I mean, I guess at that point there were probably a lot of Mark Cubans when you look at the way ownership was in the 1970s. It was so wide open in many ways, but he was someone who had a long-lasting effect at taking that Haywood case all the way to the Supreme Court and, opening up not only the path for underclassmen to play in the NBA, but in some respects the NFL as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a player who ends up leaving the team after some conflict with Lenny Wilkens in '78 was Slick Watts, who had been a really popular, hustling, just a player who had really was like a fan favorite, known for his hustle and known, of course, for his headband as well on his ball dome. Slick Watts, who was traded early on in the season to the Jazz in '78 after being popular and being kind of probably the main most popular player of that time, even sort of eclipsing Bill Russell's popularity once the disappointment kind of set in as to where they were as a team.
Yeah, which I think was an issue for the two of those guys in terms of their personal relationship. Is Slick talked about a little bit in the book he did with former Sonics beat writer Frank Hughes, talking about his career and his time with the Sonics in particular. I think that was a tough one it was tough to trade him because of the fact that he was so popular. But as good as he'd been, actually led the league in both assists and steals in the same season, which is something I think has only happened a couple of times since then. Still kind of, not fitting Lenny Wilkens' vision for the team, and then ultimately this new backcourt that they were going to build that was going to become one of the best in the NBA.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the Sonics start out very poorly, 5-17 in '78. One big key change that happens once Wilkens comes in as coach, as he brings in Dennis Johnson, begins to start him instead of bringing him off the bench, and obviously he thrives in that situation. He's an incredible defender. He's very young. He's very high flying and physical, known for being able to start fast breaks with his steals or blocks as a guard, and that pairs perfectly with his backcourt mate Gus Williams, who's incredibly fast, able to finish on the fast break, get up ahead in transition, able to had a lot of crafty moves to be able to break his way free and beat guys off the dribble, that kind of thing. He was a two-time All-NBA player during this time. Actually finished first team All-NBA in 1982 ahead of Magic Johnson, which kind of shows listeners kind of where he was. Where he was considered, not quite in '78, but as the years went along, he would definitely break out in '78, and then would even go further on into is one of the elite guards of the early '80s.
Yeah, and he was a guy who, in Golden State, they had a deep backcourt at that point. Was not long after their championship team, and Gus Williams was playing minutes, but not, I think, doing what he, having the big role that he envisioned himself having, and was able to get away from them as an early free agent and then land in Seattle. And like you said, the pairing between Gus and DJ really worked out perfectly because of the fact that neither of those guys were quite true point guards. And then you also, as I'm sure get to, had John Johnson playing a bit of a point forward role in those teams. And all three of those guys kind of chipping in as part of the playmaking duties, but interchanging a lot of things offensively, at a period where the point guard, shooting guard designation wasn't always as defined as it later became in the NBA.
Yeah. And then another key piece who was a rookie this season, Jack Sikma, who was a great shooting big man and a 7-time All-Star who also known for his beautiful blonde locks, including the perm later on in his career. What stands out to you about Sikma? And he seems like somebody who definitely was a little bit ahead of his time in terms of how he was able to be able to be a big man, showed a lot of range, even showing some three-point range later on in his career.
Right, exactly. And, just the combination of his footwork in the high post, the inside out kind of moves that he could make there, and then the high release point of shooting his jumper over his head made it essentially unblockable and was a big part of what he provided. I think a common theme about a lot of these guys, I mentioned Gus Williams was a relatively little known reserve in Golden State. DJ was the 29th pick of the draft in '76. He was actually the Sonics' third pick in that draft. So he kind of came a little bit out of nowhere. I went and revisited a feature I did on him before he passed away in conjunction, I think, with the 25th anniversary of the Sonics at that point. And he mentioned that Jerry West and then Bill Russell were the only two executives who knew anything about him in the draft. And then it was basically whichever of those teams drafted him first was going to get him. And Sikma was coming coming out of Illinois Wesleyan, not in NAIA school. So again, not a household name in the draft. They kind of, went with some obscure guys that ended up panning out quite well.
Yeah. And a holdover from the mid '70s teams that actually played his entire career, 13 seasons with the Sonics from '71 to '84, was downtown Freddie Brown. Was a very good guard for the team, who at this point was about to transition to more of a sixth man instant offense role off the bench, but had a lot of had incredible range. In fact, he led the NBA in 3-point percentage in 1980, which was the first year for the 3-pointer. He was 9th in the league in 3-pointers made. So another kind of cult favorite, but I was really the first very good player who spent his entire career with the franchise.
Yep. Another guy who was in some ways ahead of his time in terms of, what the 3-pointer could have meant to downtown. He's, first off, a great nickname in terms of it not only rhymes, which everyone loves, but also is evocative of his game, which was highly dependent on shooting from downtown. A big time scorer as a starting shooting guard earlier on in his career, but like you said, transitioning to that different role as kind of an elder statesman and a scorer off the bench at this point. And he was the guy that DJ replaced in the starting lineup when Wilkens took over.
And some of the other key guys who were on the team for most of this period, Paul Silas, who was near the end of his career as one of the great rugged rebounders and defenders of his time. He had won 2 rings with the Celtics in the mid-'70s. In fact, was the only NBA player to win 3 rings in the decade of the '70s. There were 4 players who did in the ABA, all with the Pacers, but he was the only one in the NBA to do it. And he came in. He was part of a trade that also included Marvin Webster, who would be very key for the '78 team as well. And helped sort of remake the team after the disappointment of '77, which they had missed the playoffs. As you mentioned, John Johnson, who was sort of a point forward role. He and Fred Brown had been teammates together at Iowa, so they were reunited. And he was a two-time All-Star early in his career, also a good rebounder. And then another guy who spent 5 seasons with Seattle and later became the general manager, Wally Walker.
Yes, a guy who at that point I think they figured would be a bigger part of this team. He had been, I think, the 5th pick in the draft, something like that, by the Blazers after he was a star at Virginia, and was traded early in his second season, had won the championship actually in Portland, ended up winning championships for both the Northwest teams during what was the high point of Northwest basketball. But I think they traded a first-round pick for him, figured he would be a bigger part of this, and he ended kind of a bit player off the bench during this championship era.
Yes, absolutely. So the '78 team wins 47 games, which is 6th in the league. They're 6th in SRS, and as we mentioned, they finished 42-18 once Lenny Wilkens was hired. Sort of almost the exact opposite of what the Blazers do that year, which they start 50-10, and then once Bill Walton is hurt, they end up falling off. And they beat the Lakers in the first round, 2-1. This has Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a very young Adrian Dantley, Jamal Wilkes, and an old Lou Hudson. Then the second round, they upset the Blazers, who had won 58 games, but again with Walton had been hurt basically up until this series, and then tried to come back, and then was hurt again in Game 2 and would never play for the Blazers again. As we mentioned, the team has started 50-10 after that championship year, led by Walton and Maurice Lucas and Lionel Hollins. And then they beat the Nuggets, a 48-win team, in the Western Conference Finals, 4-2. That team led by David Thompson, Dan Issel, and Bobby Jones, having just come out of the ABA a couple seasons before. And then the finals themselves, they lost to the Bullets, a 44-win team, 4-3. The Bullets were led by a really terrific front line of Elvin Hayes and Wes Unseld, who had been there since the early '70s, and Bob Dandridge, who had come along from the Bucks to really bolster one of the front line was definitely the strength of the team. The guards were not quite as strong. So, 2 top 50 players and one excellent underrated player probably in NBA history to make a really terrific front line, even though they were aging. So this is the series in which the Sonics do take it to Game 7, but fall to the Bullets in the series. It's sort of unusual for a 47-win team and a 44-win team to battle each other in the finals. Although it was a little bit more common in the 70s, there were a lot of teams that there was a lot of parity in this late 70s time with kind of lower than usual best win totals in the season and higher than usual worst win totals, and also quite a number of playoff upsets.
Yeah, I think in particular these 3 years after the ABA-NBA merger, except for Portland in the first part of the 77-78 season when they were at a different level than anyone else, it was really hard to stand out. It was kind of like the accumulation, the addition of the talent from the ABA leveled the playing field for everyone in the NBA, and no one really there were no truly great teams during this period other than, like I said, Portland with a healthy Walton in 78, but also no truly bad teams. If you're the kind of person who's upset about the super team in Golden State, you would have loved the late 70s NBA.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people did not.
No, they didn't.
Yeah. I heard on the Golden Age of Basketball podcast, I couldn't confirm this for sure, but he said that the Sonics and Bullets was apparently the 447th rated show on television that season. So, so either way, it was not rated highly. That's for sure. It was definitely a dark time. The finals of the 78 and 79 finals, which were both lowly rated, featuring the Bullets and the Sonics, ended up leading to 2 seasons of tape-delayed finals when actually the Lakers and the Sixers, big markets, were involved. So it took a while, of course, for things to turn around, but once Magic and Bird got established and Jordan came along, obviously, I think pretty much everyone listening to this knows the rest. The Game 4 of the finals was played before 39,457 fans at the Kingdome, which is the largest crowd ever to watch a single professional basketball game at the time. Game 3 of the finals had a 35,000 crowd, so definitely a strong attendance for that time. And this is, of course, there's a few arenas that a few teams are playing in these huge domes. The Jazz had played in the Superdome, and there would be throughout the 80s the Pistons would play in the Silverdome. So this was kind of an era where this was happening at least a little bit, whether they were in the midst of getting a different arena or what have you. But what stands out to you about this series? It's obviously it's a pretty close series. The 6 of the games are within 4 or one game is 8. One of those games is 8 points, but the others are within 6 or 4 points, and only really one true blowout. The Bullets in Game 6. So, what do you think of this series as a Sonics fan, beyond, of course, the pain of losing in a Game 7?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what stands out is the Sonics led this series 3-2, as you mentioned, get blown out in Game 6 in Washington. Okay, we're coming back home, playing Game 7 in front of, one of these huge crowds. I believe that one was at the Kingdome as well. And that until this June with, the Warriors losing at home to Cleveland in Game 7 was the last time that a home team had lost a Game 7 of the NBA Finals. And, of course, the famous story of that game is how poorly Dennis Johnson played in it, the guy who everyone thinks of from his Celtics days as Mr. Clutch, was the guy who really struggled in that game, shooting, let's see, when did he shoot?
14.
14, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, basically the worst game you can imagine on the biggest stage imaginable. It's, everyone thinks of John Starks, I think, in 94 is that kind of guy to really struggle in the Game 7, but it was DJ long before him.
Yeah, and he would later talk about how he obviously was embarrassed by that performance and dedicated himself to try to be able to return and to play well, which he would definitely do in the next season. But yeah, that was the Bullets really kind of did that with a pretty balanced. The Unseld led we had 15-9, and then everyone else, the main players in that team, Hayes and Dandridge, Tom Henderson, Charles Johnson, Mitch Kupchak, all were in double figures. So it was a balanced effort for them. The the Sonics were led by Marvin Webster, who had probably the game of his life with 27 and 19, and Sikma 21 and 11. But as we mentioned, Johnson struggled, and Williams was 4 of 12 for 12 points. So a struggle for them, but they would turn things around in 79. They finished 52 and 30, which was second in the lead, and they were sixth in the league in SRS. They lost Marvin Webster to the Knicks, but as compensation, they added burly power forward Lonnie Shelton, who actually was probably a better complement for Sikma, and actually after an injury moved him to center, where he probably, I think he generally played center for the most of the rest of his career, so that probably ended up working out better for the Sonics in the long run.
Yeah, and this was Shelton was such big compensation, essentially, that after the Larry O'Brien originally awarded the Sonics that and a first-round pick, a judge came in and ruled that compensation excessive, and I believe he took away gave them another first-round pick as part of this process.
Yes, don't miss the compensation days, I don't think.
No. I mean, that would be fun to write about now.
Yeah,
that would certainly keep things interesting.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that would add a whole new dimension to that. That'd probably make your job a lot harder. They had a bye in the first round. They beat the Lakers again in the second round, 4-1. Lakers were a similar team. They'd added Norm Nixon to that core. And then they beat the Suns in the Western Conference Finals, 4-3. Suns were a 50-win team that year. They were about 3 seasons removed from having made the NBA Finals in 76, and they still had Paul Westphal and Alvin Adams. They'd also added Walter Davis and Truck Robinson, who had come from the Jazz. The Sonics had a great start. They were up 2-0 after winning both games at home. And in fact, there's an SI article where John Johnson says after game 2, this is probably their best shot. If they play a better game in this series, I'll be pretty surprised. And then after that, the Sonics end up shooting miserably. Sikma between games 2 and 5 was 14 for 56 during that stretch. Williams and Johnson also really struggled from the field, and they were down 3-2 after losing at home in game 5, but were able to turn things around and won narrowly in Phoenix, 106-105 in game 6, and in Seattle, 114-110 in game 7. I would imagine this is probably a pretty noteworthy series in Sonics history. Is there anything that stands out to you about it?
Yeah, it's weird. This is one that I think kind of has slipped through the cracks historically. It should probably be more notable than it is, given what happened afterwards. And, doing the same thing that Washington had done to the Sonics the year before in terms of coming back from a 3-2 deficit. They didn't have to win Game 7 on the road, but did have to win that Game 6 on the road, which was played on Mother's Day in Phoenix. And one of the favorite random stories, I have this book that's from the Sonics 25th anniversary season that has just a bunch of random stories about key games, key events in franchise history, and they note that Paul Westphal's mom sang the national anthem before this game.
Nice.
And then the Sonics win at 106-105, a 1-point win in Phoenix, where they're all ready to go to the finals and try to avenge 76 for them. And instead, it's the Sonics who end up going back to the finals.
So they reach the finals, and they end up there's some excitement at the time with the idea that Washington, they're a 54-win team. They were a little bit favored in the series, and obviously they beat them the year before, so there was definitely a chance there. But as we mentioned, Washington was definitely an older team, and the Sonics were a very young team, and the Sonics were able to win the series 4-1 and won 4 straight after losing narrowly in game 1. In fact, the Bullets had a really rough time getting through the playoffs. They had to come back from a 3-1 deficit against the Spurs in the conference finals. They also had to come back against the Hawks in 7 games earlier on in that playoff. So they had a tough stretch run, which was tough on them. Although the Sonics didn't have it too easy either. So I guess both teams were pretty tired. But it was 36 hours after they beat the Spurs, where they had to play the Sonics in Game 1 of the finals. But they ended up actually winning that game, although they blew an 18-point lead in the third quarter, and it came very close to blowing the game. In fact, there was sort of a Dennis Johnson attempted to block a jumper, and then the whistles sounded, and then Larry Wright, the player, was awarded 2 free throws with no time on the clock. So it's unusual for a foul to be called in that situation, and he made both free throws. But Wilkens said after the game, or later would say that he felt confident after this game that even though they had lost game 1, they felt that coming back from 18 points down said a lot about them, and that they would end up winning the series. And then handled things pretty easily after that. They won game 2 fairly handily, shut down Dandridge and Hayes quite a bit. Game 3 was in the Kingdome with 35,000 fans, and they had another pretty easy win. Gus Williams had 31 points, and DJ had 17 with 9 rebounds and 2 blocks. And Sikma had 21 and 17 in that game. Game 4 is probably the most notable game of this series. It went to double overtime, and the Sonics won narrowly, 114 to 112 on as DJ blocked a shot at the end to prevent Washington from being able to tie the game.
Yeah, and I mean that was basically the key to the series, because they go up 3-1 at that point with 3 chances left to close out the series. And even one thing we forgot to mention about the '78 finals is that's where, if he didn't invent the phrase, Dick Motta at least popularized the phrase "It ain't over till the fat lady sings," referring to their 3-2 deficit that they came back from the year before. But 3-1 was just too much to overcome.
Yeah, especially overcoming it again after they'd overcome it in the previous series. So. So game 5, the Bullets did start off pretty hot. In fact, Elvin Hayes scored 20 points in the first half. However, the Sonics at the end of the third quarter went on a 12-0 run to be down only 3. And then Freddie Brown hit 4 or 5 shots in the final 13 minutes, and the Sonics won 97 to 93. DJ was named Finals MVP, and he said that he was just a funny-looking black kid with red hair and freckles. He was just doing what needed to be done, and praised his teammates, including Gus Williams, at the end of it. And then I hadn't known this until recently, but they actually both celebrated by lighting cigars in the the Red Auerbach tradition. So I thought that was kind of a neat story.
Yeah, and another Dick Motta quote. So he kind of talked about the Game 7 the previous year, and I think this was before Game 5, said, as you get closer and closer, these games get bigger and bigger. Let's put it on Dennis Johnson. Let's just see. And Johnson responds with 21 points in Game 5 and ends up winning Finals MVP. So yes. A lot of, evening up for the year before.
Yes, absolutely. And Johnson, there's a Michael D. McClellan interview at CelticNation.com from 2002, I believe, and talks about how the first title was the greatest of highs. There's something special about doing it for the first time, and that feeling can never be duplicated, even though the other championships were rewarding in their own ways. And talked about how that team was so young and talented, at all the makings of a dynasty, and remembered that the talk was all about repeating as a champion. So going into 1980, they. Johnson, Williams, Sikma, Shelton, and Walker were all 25 or younger. Expecting that certainly seemed like a team that would be able to do so. But 1980 comes along. It doesn't quite work out like that way. Of course, Magic Johnson comes into the league, and the Lakers become the power team of the West. Although the Sonics are they're certainly not bad, 56-26, fourth in the league, and also fourth in SRS. But this is the year where things start to really come to a head between Dennis Johnson and Lenny Wilkens. DJ becoming known for his moodiness and sulking, feeling some resentment over his role, and Gus Williams for taking more shots with him. It's talked about in the breaks of the game. In fact, there's a chapter dedicated to it, and and it's been mentioned in other publications. Do you know much about kind of what if there was more to it than that, or kind of what the issues were between him and Wilkens?
I don't think there was anything more, at least that I've heard in any of the interviewing or research I've done. I mean, I think it's just kind of a classic disease of me kind of situation with a team that has now won the championship, been to the finals 2 years in a row, and as Pat Riley has talked about at length and has been quoted from him, everyone starts to want a little bit more after that, and I think Dennis Johnson was probably the biggest symptom of that for the Sonics.
Yes, and he did. And Johnson, of course, would be traded to Phoenix after this season, and had similar issues in Phoenix, and then ironically came to the Celtics, and then I think was pretty much known as the perfect teammate. Larry Bird always complimented him as being the best guy to play with, and so it's sort of ironic for. And disappointing for Sonics fans that if he had been able to have that maturity that he would have later in his career, there certainly was potential for the Sonics to match up very well with the Lakers after 1980, because as we saw in the '84 finals with the way that Dennis Johnson played defense against Magic, he certainly would have changed the equation for their battles with the Lakers potentially over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, just the Lakers, it's not that things didn't go well for the Sonics in 79-80. It was actually, they won 56 games. It was the best point differential by far of any of the teams in this run. It was just that kind of the whole landscape of the league changed to some extent with the arrival of Magic. And, after this era of parity, it starts getting back to the point where it's more of a star-dominated league. Because that's, a thing we haven't talked about, and maybe this will come up more in terms of just the legacy of the team of this era, is that notably, DJ ended up making the Hall of Fame posthumously, but this was for a long period of time the only championship team in decades that had won a championship without a Hall of Famer, and certainly still without that inner circle superstar that all of a sudden the Lakers had two of those.
Yeah, absolutely, and. And they obviously they had very good players, and you could definitely make a pretty strong case for Jack Sikma to make the Hall of Fame. That does seem a bit of an oversight, but even so, he's certainly not. He's more of the borderline level of Hall of Famer, not like certainly not the level of Magic and Kareem for sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, 56 wins. They had added a third Johnson to the team. Vinnie Johnson had a very small role on this team later of Pistons fame, microwave off the bench fame. So they had John Johnson, Dennis Johnson, and Vinnie Johnson. They all pretty much were known by their initials to avoid confusion.
Yeah, and Vinnie Johnson was drafted with that compensatory pick I mentioned earlier that they had gotten from the Knicks as part of the Marvin Webster deal, and then the Sonics ended up having to give up their 81 first-round pick to even it up.
Yes, yeah. So they beat the Blazers in the first round. The Blazers, this is the team that's covered in Breaks of the Game. That's followed along by David Halberstam in that classic book. Billy Ray Bates and Kermit Washington, probably the best-known players from that team. Then they had another classic series in the second round against the Milwaukee Bucks. This was the last year that the Bucks were in the Western Conference. They would move to the East once realignment happened. Once the Mavericks joined the league in '81, and Marcus Johnson, Bob Lanier, Sidney Moncrief, or young Sidney Moncrief are the key players on this team. I think Lanier had been traded in midseason to the Bucks, and this series went all 7 games. 6 of them were decided by 5 points or less. 4 of them were won by the road team, and there were 2 overtimes in the series. And there's a incredible game-winning 3 by Dennis Johnson in the first game of the series. The Sonics nearly threw the game away, but after a quick-made basket by the Bucks, Dennis, given the ball inbounded, he dribbled down the court and then took an off-balance 3-pointer to win the game. This was, of course, the first season of the three-pointer, so the idea of having a game-winning three-pointer in this situation is still a pretty new concept for the league.
Yeah, it's certainly an exciting play, although not everyone was so excited about it. Bob Lanier described it as a lucky shot and determined that based on the fact that they were so lucky to win, that the Bucks were going to win the series.
Well, he was not correct in that.
He was not.
Yes. So yes, they are able to the Sonics. There's another time where they were down 3-2 in the series actually, and then they're able to win 86-85 in Milwaukee, and then in Game 6 and then Game 7 win 98-94 in Seattle. So it's interesting how a lot of very close margins with the Sonics.
Yeah, I mean, which I think is befitting, the fact that don't have a lot of star talent, and it was just basically always a grind for them throughout this era.
Yeah, and then they lost to the Lakers in the Western Conference Finals. Even though it was 4-1, it was a fairly close series. They actually won Game 1 in LA by 1 point, and then the Lakers won the next 4. But fairly close margins there. So certainly, even though the Sonics lost this season, they certainly were competitive with the Lakers during this season. So. Next season is where things start take a big downturn. Dennis Johnson in the offseason is traded for Paul Westphal. And after he left the team, Lenny Wilkens called Dennis Johnson a cancer and said that you can't get rid of the body, but you can cut out the cancer. And he said they're better off eliminating him rather than dealing with him. And then they were happy to get Paul Westphal in the trade, who was still a very effective player, even though he was getting close to 30 at that point. But unfortunately for the Sonics, Westphal missed most of the season. I think played like 37 games and was fairly ineffective when he did play, while DJ was All-NBA first team for a 57-win team, although that team didn't end up being upset in the playoffs.
Yeah, he had a series of stress fractures in his right foot, Westphal, that sidelined him that season, and they did not get what they were expecting to get out of him.
And then the other key thing is Gus Williams held out for the season, which he had been asking, I believe, for $800,000, and the Sonics offered him $2.5 million for 5 years, so $500,000 a season. And there's an article from February of '81 from SI talking about how Sikma's kind of the one guy who's left. Paul Silas had retired. Lonnie Shelton missed most of I think all the season with injuries. So he's kind of the one stalwart who's still sticking around. And even though he had a very good he was leading his career highs at the time in scoring and rebounding, he said he missed Williams. He said, "All I know that in the old days when I got a rebound and turn, there was always something there. Now there's often no one. I could count the number of fast breaks and easy baskets we've had on one hand." So I can't really think of another situation where a player of that caliber held out for an entire season and then would come back to the team.
Yeah, it's pretty unthinkable that even then that it would have happened. But he as you said, he was asking for $800,000 a year, which he eventually got in the summer of '81 after the season. And at that point, Sam Shulman said, if I had known then what I know now, I would have just signed him last year. The market is different now, and I didn't foresee the conditions we have today.
Yeah, and obviously this was going to be a time in which player salaries would rise, considerably. Magic Johnson would sign that famous 20-year contract for $1 million a year, and then that in a few years would be would be a laughable amount of money. So, and also it was during the time when contracts were often renegotiated, which kind of created situations where a player could, sulk and be angry, and then, would eventually the team might cave in and pay him more money. And there was, there's certainly in the NBA today, there is tension between players, with disparate salaries, but now, you're pretty much locked into the amount of money that you're going to make while your contract is, as long as you're going to play. Where back then there was much more chance for these problems, I think, to kind of fester because the ability to sort of change your contract was there, which I think was sort of derailed some of these teams. It caused a lot of difficulties, kind of in the 70s and in the 80s, and kind of led to obviously some changes in the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that's happened with the salary cap over the last few decades is kind of a response to trying to clean up some of the issues. So, whether it's rookie holdouts, that then you have the rookie scale and things like that, sort of it's an entirely different climate in terms of the salary cap now than it was then. And that's a big reason why, is to try to avoid these kind of things.
Yeah. So once they have Williams back, they're still a strong team in 81-82. They're 52 wins, fifth in the league, and a fifth in the league in SRS as well. So, pretty stout team there. Bill Hanslick and James Donaldson are sort of emerged as contributors to this team. John Johnson only played 14 games, and this was his final season. And Williams would talk about how he, it wasn't just about money for him. It was only part of the reason. He said that he had certain principles as a man, and they weren't being met. The contract adjustment was part of it, sure, but there were other things I also had to clear my mind. And he talked about how he was able to stay in shape by playing a lot of playground basketball, and was sort of actually he was surprised at the idea that that anyone would think that he wouldn't come back. It just is fine, and he did come back. He was just as good of a player, and led them to the second round. They beat the Rockets in the first round 2-1. The Rockets really had Moses Malone, but not a whole lot of else. Elvin Hayes and Calvin Murphy won the last legs there. And then in the second round to the Spurs, they lost 4-1. The Spurs led by George Gervin and Mike Mitchell. Even though it was one-sided to a degree, most of the games were competitive, as per usual with the Sonics. And then 82-83 was kind of the last gasp of them, really being a pretty good team. They dropped a bit. They were 48 wins, 8th in the league, and 7th in the league in SRS. They added David Thompson that year. That was his last full season. He would play a partial season the next year, but he had come over from Denver, and he had obviously been one of the great talent shooting guards of all time. At the time, and unfortunately had drug issues that led to a decline. But his numbers at least were pretty productive. 16, 3 and 3 on a pretty good shooting percentage, adding to the William Shelton Sikma core. Freddie Brown still hanging out of the team, would play one more season after this, but they lost to the Blazers 2-0 in the first round with Paxson, Jim Paxson, Michael Thompson, Calvin Nat as the key guys there. Last season for them pre Clyde Drexler, where they would transition to that era of the team. So that's basically it for that team. I don't know. Overall, something that's sort of interesting about where Sonics fans are right now, unfortunately, with not having a team, but there's a large constituency of fans who are invested in the team's history because there's nothing going on now. So, if you're a Sonics fan, really looking back at the history is the only way you can kind of still keep that connection with the team.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, the Sonics are more popular now than the last couple of years before they moved because, besides the whole ongoing, will they or won't they, the anger with ownership and everything like that, now the Sonics can't screw anything up. They're just there in perpetuity in history, and that's I think really what is remembered. Now I would say, and this may be a function of my own age, that it's probably more related to the '90s teams and the Kemp and Payton era than it is to the late '70s teams. I mean, obviously for people of a different generation, I'm sure that that's more what they think of with the Sonics. But the other element is it's interesting. I don't feel like people around here really play the what if game very much. I mean, probably people within the team do, but because of the fact that they did win a championship, that set them apart from every Seattle team that came afterwards, at least on the men's professional side, until the Seahawks in 2013 or 2000. I think that's 2013. I should probably know that off the top of my head. Super Bowl 48.
That's okay.
To say.
That's all right.
So the fact that there was all these other what ifs in Seattle sports history. The Peyton Kemp years, the Mariners when they had multiple Hall of Famers and Griffey and A-Rod and Randy Johnson and maybe someday Edgar Martinez and, couldn't even get to the World Series. All of that kind of to just win one championship is unimaginable success for the city of Seattle, not like what more could have been.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I mean, when you're a city that doesn't have like this, it doesn't have like a huge history of sports success. This, Seattle doesn't. That you do have a take what you can get. Certain element of that, I would imagine, and also, as you mentioned, there isn't like that transcendent player that played for the Sonics that Kemp and Peyton, Peyton certainly was, a better player than anybody on this Sonics team, and Kemp was just such an exciting player to watch, and obviously they were playing during a more popular time in the NBA's history. But I guess without like having that superstar to kind of play during this time, that really super duper star, there is maybe a little bit less attraction to explore this team. Although, like I said, there is some nice Sonics history being written on the on the internet. Having that constituency, keep that spirit alive of the team is a nice thing to have. While hopefully waiting for a new team to come along hopefully in a few years.
Yes, and to hopefully reclaim the history, which is now with Oklahoma City, where Thunder fans don't really have any connection to the '79 championship.
Sure.
The organization hasn't really made any point of it, but it's this weird in limbo thing where officially the history belongs to the Oklahoma City organization at this point.
Yeah. So, well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate you taking time to discuss this team with me. Is there anything you'd like to, anything else to talk about, or anything you want to share with the listeners?
Well, I should plug, you mentioned Jack Sikma for the Hall of Fame. Last year, I made the case for that around the time that the Hall of Fame inductions were taking place. He's number one in the Basketball Reference Hall of Fame probability among guys who are eligible and haven't been voted in, and right up there in all the other advanced stats. And yet somehow he has not even been a finalist, isn't even in consideration at this point, which is something I would definitely like to see change. So if people want to search for that, I can maybe tweet it out after you post the link, or then also otherwise just Google Jack Sikma Hall of Fame ESPN probably will bring it up.
Yes, we'll make sure we put a link to it in the show notes as well. So,
good call.
So thanks everyone for checking us out. You can find us at harborparoxysm.com. And you can find us on iTunes and Stitcher. Please leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. And we're going to continue our Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s series throughout the offseason. So if you're enjoying the episodes, please let us know. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.